I'm Park Howell, and welcome to the Business of Story, where I consult, teach, coach, and speak on the applied science and bewitchery of brand and business storytelling, so that you can clarify your story to amplify your impact and simplify your life.
I thought it was just a stupid picture of a pig in the ocean. But after hearing that story, I had to have it. Now I wasn't just buying a picture. I was buying a story. Story literally made the picture worth more money to me.
That's what businesses are about. People buy brands. People buy stories much more than anything else.
I work with a lot of big enterprise companies, but let's just say I always tell folks, drop the PowerPoint, close your laptops, start with your story.
If you want people to get engaged and you want people to act, you have to tell them an emotionally powerful story. That's with great characters, it's with uncertain outcomes, and it's with high stakes and drama.
All business strategy is a story.
We have Dr. George Basile on the Business of Story. Basile, am I saying that right?
Sounds
Basile?
good to me, Basile.
Basile.
It's Italian, Basile.
Basile.
Yeah, my name in Italian sounds very good. Giorgio Matteo Basile.
And we're rolling, folks.
We're
Welcome
rolling.
to the Business of Story.
Very serious professor here, very serious.
I have Dr. George Basile.
Basile. That's a Dr. George Basile. There
I
you go.
know him as Dr. George Basile. And I met him about 6 years ago at Arizona State University when he and our good friend, Bruno Sarda, came in and met with me about helping pull together a communications curriculum for the Executive Masters for Sustainability Leadership in the School of Sustainability at ASU. And it was one of the coolest things I've ever done. And I got to hang out with really cool people like Dr. George Basile, a physicist, biophysicist, and one of the chief professors at the School of Sustainability. And you've been there for what, 10 years?
Just about a decade, yeah.
And one of the first, the first School of Sustainability built in the U.S.
United States. Yeah, at Arizona State University.
So you must have been one of the first fleet of professors to come in, and you're still doing your thing there.
Yeah, one of the early in folks in an emerging space that we all hear a lot about sustainability, but probably makes sense to almost nobody. Mm-hmm. So we're working on that, and that's what's going on at the school. Yeah. So yeah, it's been a real thrilling ride.
And on today's show, what we're going to be talking about is the energy and force, the physics, if you will, of story, and how we use story and narrative to bring people together, how it has a power in and of its own. And we're going to explore that a little bit and how marketers and branders can really think about story in a little bit different way through the physics of story. And then we'll move into how we can be using it to advance sustainability initiatives, anything from helping people have a greater understanding and grasp and actually move on climate change and global warming to social causes to environmental work. So there's a lot of ground to cover today, but I want to start about 4 years ago when you and I were standing on a train platform in Amsterdam. And we were with our students. I think it was our second cohort for the Executive Masters program. And we were over there for a week in June working with the likes of Philips and KLM and doing some really interesting things in the study abroad program. And I remember talking to you as we were waiting for the train to come up and kind of surrounded around by our executives. And I just said, George, why physics? I mean, you could be a doctor in all kinds of sciences. What made you choose physics? And I remember what you told me. You said, because physicists are the poets of science. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, so, physics is something that people often think of as physics, right? Like maybe either dry or very scientific.
Like Einstein and...
Yeah. And you don't much think of, say, story in physics necessarily, or that physicists have to use story. So let me answer that in part, but let me tell you a little story. Let's talk about a guy who, people think of physics. Let's talk about a guy who people might know, Albert Einstein, slightly famous physicist. So Einstein was famous for what we called thought experiments. But what they actually were little internal stories. That's what they really are. And one that he used to, that's one of my favorites, was imagine, and it goes with the train platform. Imagine you're on a train, right? And Einstein was doing this stuff at the turn of the century. Trains were around. So you're on this train and you're traveling at, 20 miles an hour on the train. It's going along. And you see somebody outside and you want to toss them something. So you take this package, and you open your window and you're going 20 miles an hour and you toss the package out. And you toss the package at, say, another 20 miles an hour. So when the guy catches it, you were already going at 20 miles an hour. You toss the package out at 20 miles an hour. So when the guy catches it, it's going 40 miles an hour, right? I added the 20 miles of my toss to the 20 miles of the train. Everybody's like, okay.
Because you threw it 20 miles an hour.
Threw it towards him at 20 miles an hour, and I was already going 20 miles an hour. So he catches it. He's like 40 miles an hour, which, hopefully I didn't throw him that ham and rice sandwich, because 40 mile an hour ham and rice sandwich, that's going to be a mess. So, okay, so that's all standard. Now Einstein says, what if I'm traveling on the train and I have a flashlight? And what if the train's going really fast? Like the train's almost going near the speed of light. So it's hauling along the speed of light. So I lean out and I shine my flashlight at the guy. Now the light coming out of the flashlight is, by definition, it's traveling the speed of light. But the train's almost traveling the speed of light. So when the guy sees it, it should be traveling almost twice the speed of light. But it isn't. It's traveling the speed of light. Okay? Now here's where physicists need to become poets, because that literally makes no sense. That's impossible. I throw my sandwich out of the train at 20 miles an hour. The train's going 20 miles. It's going 40 miles an hour. I shine my light at the speed of light off something that's already going the speed of light. It should be going twice the speed of light. It isn't, right? Now Einstein, and here's where the brilliance of do you want to talk about the power of story? Einstein, well, if the speed of light is constant, so it's always going the speed of light, and all speed is how fast you go, right? So it's just the amount of distance you travel over the time that you have, right? So we all have driven around 60 miles an hour. We're going a mile a minute. So the speed of light doesn't change. So he said, if the speed of light never changes, no matter what, then distance and time have to change in order to keep it constant. So it turns out from our physics, everybody, that distance, space itself, and time itself are malleable. They're different depending on how fast you're going, what your perspective is. Like literally, for the guy on the station, not on the train, when he looks at the clocks on the train, the clocks will be going slower. The train will be shorter, okay? So Einstein used this little simple story, right, to change the world. I mean, literally, we all now think of the world in this very different way. And physics does that constantly to you, where it's always bending, whether it's black holes, right, or relativity, or electromagnets, or any of the things we think about. There's so many things out there that they don't make sense to the human mind, and you have to become a poet to sort of, restructure that.
Yeah, and one of the real blessings in my life was able to travel abroad with you and Bruno and some others, and be able to sit down and pick your brain. 'Cause I know we used to have some of these crazy conversations in the bus, and I just felt dumber by the time I got back. But right. I was like, whoa, that's so cool. And folks, I got to tell you about this book that I read almost a year ago. In fact, Michelle gave it to me for Father's Day last year, and I was hesitant to dive into it. And I am so glad I did. It's by David Christian. It's called Origin Story, A Big History of Everything. And the subhead on it is From the Big Bang to the First Stars, our solar system, life on Earth, dinosaurs, Homo sapiens, agriculture, and ice age, empires, fossil fuels, a moon landing, and mass globalization, and what happens next. And he covers all of that in like 300 amazing pages. And so as, a lightweight when it comes to physics, it really opened my mind up to all this different stuff happening. And I wrote a blog post about this and sent it to you. And I said, George, it just totally occurred to me that story is like physics. It has an energy and a force all its own. And you were so kind because you read it was like a 1,500 word post. You go, oh, Park, that's really great. I need to fix a couple things on your sites, but I see where you're going with this. And so I want to just read this one definition, and then we can talk about it. And I want you to kind of, you can...
Sure.
You can help coach me on this. But when I think about this, and they talk, by the way, Christian talks about the new sphere, and that it's like this whole new biome, I guess, for lack of a better term, that we have created through the knowledge that we share through the internet, and how it's so accessible now that it's created this whole another realm of being. So it goes back to me thinking about, well, if that's the case, then that is story. We're communicating through story and data and other things, but we're using that, and it has this energy. And so I was thinking it's a bit like thermodynamics. Storytelling has an energy and force all its own. And then I was looking up the definition for physics. And I thought, could I change that and say, all right, can I use that same definition for physics, but let's put it to narrative and story? And here's what I came up with. Story dynamics is the narrative science that studies imagination and its motion and behavior through space and time of a story and its related entities of energy and force. Story dynamics is one of the most fundamental communication disciplines, and its main goal is to understand how to make the universe behave through the stories we tell and live. Now, I took the physics definition off of Wikipedia, so it's, layperson
our most trusted source in the universe.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
And I changed like 5 words in it, and for story and narrative, and at least to me, it's like, dude, there's like tremendous energy that you could actually measure through the power of story and narrative.
Yeah. And I think you're right. You win the prize. I think you're absolutely right. Physics, its basic purpose. One, physics is what drives physicists? Curiosity, right? Physicists are all a bunch of curiosity creatures, right?
What drives storytellers?
Curiosity, right? I mean, that's just human
beings.
Yeah, that's human beings, right? And so physics tries to describe the natural world. It tries to find the underlying principles and mechanisms that generate the complexity. So it tries to describe the complexity by getting to these basic principles that we can all rely on, law, conservation of energy, things like that.
Thermodynamics.
Thermodynamics are, so in thermodynamics, you have like the conservation of energy, and that things tend to get messier. That's entropy, right? We found out that energy is actually a combination of those two things. It's energy that you can use to do useful things.
And entropy, real quick, just to help people understand it, and it was good for me to understand it in this idea of free energy.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. So when we think about, conservation of energy, there's this thing called energy, which we're like, okay, we get that energy. Well, physicists are like, actually, what is that? Well, there's a type of energy that you can use to do stuff. We call that work, right? And there's free energy, right? Energy. So this is like available energy to do something. And physics is full of all this vocabulary like work and charm and quirks, right? Work actually means like I can do something with it. I can roll that wheel. I can lift that bale, whatever it is, right? Turns out when you add up all the work you've done, there's still more energy left over. That turns out to be entropy. Now you're like, well, what is entropy? Turns out entropy is the orderliness of something. Turns out there's 2 parts of doing work. One is the actual physical thing of doing work. The other thing is either putting things in the right order so that the work matters, or taking them apart and making them messier. Entropy is just this part of the world where things can literally be ordered and disordered. And it turns out, as we all know, you don't cry over spilt milk. Well, when you knock your glass over, the milk doesn't get more ordered. It becomes a mess. When you drop the deck of cards on the floor, it becomes a mess. So
and that's entropy.
Entropy is the state of order of things, right? And it's actually really important because when we use something up, so for example, when you drink a glass of water, you don't actually use up the water. You use up the energy that you had to do to get that water in the right place in the glass at that time. You also use up the order of the glass of water, right? So I drink the water and now it's coming out of me when I'm talking.
Because it's in that vessel, so it's ordered.
It's all ordered. It's one nice place, and then we're going to, now it becomes disordered. And if I wanted to get into the vessel again, guess what? I'd have to do some work to put it together. And as I put it together, both the energy I use to put it together and its order, in that case, would increase, right? So we usually run around the world making messes. And actually the sun is the thing that actually pays for our messes. It's the thing that's out there like doing photosynthesis. Anyway, so to get back to your, is this right? Yeah. So physics is about the physical world, right? Stories are about the human world, right? And of course, stories in a sense have to obey physics in the sense that we are physical creatures. So we eat food and we have our energy we're also imagination creatures, right? So our stories both have dimensions of physics that we can talk about a little bit. They also allow us to, in a sense, escape physics, right? But I think absolutely you can talk about stories having things like momentum, right? So momentum, we all know sort of momentum is in physics, it's mass times velocity. What it is the tendency of something to keep going in the direction it's going, right? Well, you can imagine a story that can help people, right, continue to head in the direction they're heading, right? So, and you can imagine a story that builds momentum, right? We see this in politics all the time. People come up with stories that get people excited. Those people tell the same story. The story gets more people excited. And next thing you know, you've got a movement. That's why we call it a movement, because the story put people into motion. It created momentum along the story arc, right?
Probably one of my favorite to that would be JFK's moonshot.
Huge.
So he just invented a complete science fiction tale to build momentum, to spend $25 billion for the Apollo program, but to place a man on the moon and return him safely to the Earth before the 1960s.
Well, and that brings up another piece of physics that's in stories. So the idea of a vision, right? So here's some biophysics. We're visual creatures, so we create visions. Dogs might create. Well, I don't know. What would your nose create? Sensations. A dog might have a nosation or something like that, right? But
I'll buy that.
Yeah, right. We get a smellation, right? JFK would have said,
a snozation.
We're going to that thing that smells like cheese. We create visions, right? Because we're visual creatures, right? So when JFK said we're going to the moon, he created a gravitational attractor for us. That vision of going to the moon literally attracts human beings through that story again and brings them together. So not only is now there momentum, like here's a story that can generate movement. Movement to where? Well, we're headed to the moon, right? So now you've got gravity.
Story has gravity, yeah.
Story has gravity.
Which is another primal force of physics?
You could argue it's the primal force of the universe. So gravity is the thing that pulls all the bodies together. So like the Earth, the sun, right? The Earth going around the sun, our galaxies, black holes, all these sorts of things, the engine of you can say that the engine of the universe at that scale is gravity. And you could say that the engine of society at that scale are these gravitational stories, these stories that just pull us forward. And some of them are, they're iconic American, rugged individualism, right? The idea that we're can-do people, right? These are fundamental to us, whatever your culture is and whatnot. So gravity, momentum, these are things that I think are very good descriptions of how story and physics come together.
And how about stories as that comes as an organizational force? So you go to an organization, a brand, a big company or whatever, and sometimes you see entropy at work where they're falling apart. See, and in my mind, entropy is the chaos that ensues, not just the organizing principle, but the chaos that comes. Am I right on that? That it's more like, and the way he talks about it in here is you've got that, he says, picture a waterfall. And this is David Christian again, and this is where it worked for me, is that the molecules in that river are organized in that river until they crest over the waterfall, and then entropy ensues because they fly all over the place. And as I was so jonesing on this, I was driving into the office the next day, and here comes this big dump truck full of dirt, diesel, and he just comes coasting around a corner, and then you can see him, pump the gas, because all of a sudden all this black smoke, diesel fumes, came out of his top stacks. And I'm going, oh my God, that's entropy in action. They have the fuel, the diesel, which is now formulated in one place, and they're burning it to create the energy, to create momentum for this dump truck. And it's now spewing out the exhaust because that energy has to go not only forward for the truck, but there's that extra energy is now being spewed out into the universe, quite literally. And to me, I'm like, oh my God, it's entropy. And I ran in here and told Luis that, and he goes, dude, you are like gone. You got to stop. You got to stop hanging out with George, and you got to stop reading this stuff.
No. So I think in terms of organizations, this is actually a really important sort of.
And we're talking about people now.
We're talking about people. So one, we have to understand we have a weird relationship with entropy. We think of that disorder, going to disorder. We have words for it. Messy. A problem, disordered, chaos, disorganized, right? It's actually just part of the system. So, for example, a tree uses entropy to distribute its pollen and seeds. Trees make lots of pollen and seeds. They literally use the messy part of entropy to spread themselves.
But isn't the sun actually using that tree? It's shooting all this energy down to the planet, and photosynthesis is the sun's way, or that energy's way, to disperse itself through entropy into the universe.
That's right.
And it happens just to create these really amazing plants.
Yeah. So the tree's just to your, like with the organization, the tree's balancing, making order. It's using the sun to make order. The sun's getting more disorganized, but it also uses disorder as part of its life cycle. Right? So there's a few interesting lessons in here for, say, business and organizations. One is, as human beings, we are actually very, very ordered creatures. Literally, as a human being, you are so far away from equilibrium. Like if you just let nature take its course, you'll eventually break up into dust. That's what entropy does. Entropy is constantly trying to sort you out into the lowest energy, most distributed way you can be. We don't like that. I don't want to be dust.
Can I ask you one question on that? Because this will help Luis and I too, because his argument, and I don't know which is right, is the universe wants to organize itself. And my argument after reading this stuff is, no, I think the universe actually wants to disorganize itself. Is there a balance there between organizing and disorganizing?
Well, again, so we're already doing the story thing right now. The universe doesn't want to do anything,
gotcha.
right?
But
this is important because this physics, story, these are all about human beings exploring the universe. This isn't esoteric. This is you and me engaged in the universe. Some other creature from some other planet might see it very differently. So we tend to split things into organized and disorganized. The universe doesn't. The universe is like, no, these are all part of a whole. The universe goes, as far as we know, the universe is going through a phase where it's got a lot of organization and it's heading towards what we would call a more disorganized, where literally you're shifting from where you have more of your energy in organized things like planets, and you're shifting to where you have more of your energy in entropy, which is disorganized. But in theory, right, once you're all disorganized too, that might be the precursor for then some other, Big Bang event that then
gravity starts taking over and pulling these people back. Okay,
sort of. But anyway,
all right.
So, all right, we rock off in the black hole. To bring it back to story and organizations, we all have experience with. Just like us, organizations actually, entropy wants to make them become disorganized. There's more ways to be disorganized than there are to be organized. So just by statistics, if you take an infinite number of organizations, there's many, many more ways to be a mess than there is to be organized. So story is one of the vehicles that we use to help us create order. We use stories, for example, to make it make sense for us to have leadership, right? Where it's okay for that. There's a trade-off, right? We use stories in our organizations to help us understand other people's perspectives so we're not thrown off, right? And we see when those things break down. Right? We see in organizations when, the water cooler cycle gets going and you start to have competing narratives, and those narratives can then be destructive, right? And they create a disorganized office. We've all heard that old, a saying that like culture trumps strategy. You could say story trumps strategy. You have to have alignment between your organization and your strategy and your vision, that gravitational pull. Right? So what's your vision? You have to have alignment between your organization and momentum. How is your story building direction for you? You have to have alignment with cohesion, right? You have to have a story of us, right? That an organization is a group of people coming together to do something. That's what human enterprise is. So, story, as a sort of, again, an analogy to physics and entropy, it's without a great story and without a functional story, organizations don't have any scaffolding on which to make sense to the individuals who all have their own personal narratives and stories going on. Sort of like the atomic theory of gases. You can have a gas that has pressure, it has volume. As you drill in with a microscope, you can see all the little atoms buzzing around and they're doing all the things. All of them doing their thing, they add up to pressure. They add up to volume, but they're each on their own little personal journeys too, right? So this is where having the DNA of your organization, the mission of these sorts of things, having these things lined up, they really do have not just analogies with physics, but in point of fact, there actually is an entropy of organization. Your organization wants to tend to disorder. Again, just because there's more ways to be, as painful as this is, there's many more ways to be dysfunctional than there are to be functional in that specific thing you want to do. Like there are many more ways to have a deck, a hand of cards, like you're playing poker. There's a lot more ways to have your 5 cards than there are to have a straight flush. Yeah. There's only so many ways you can have a straight flush, whereas there's almost an infinite number of ways to have a bad hand, right? So story plays this organizing role in an organization that is very much like,
And if you were looking at an organization from way out, so it's like in a petri dish, and you're looking at each individual as its own little atom running around in the physicist's mind, are we seeing the behavior of people in that organization is like a fractal or a mirror of how the universe just generally operates? That the same pressures, you know what I'm asking here? I don't even know enough if I'm asking it the right way, but to me, the behavior of an organization, if you pull way out, could almost be like the behavior of a nucleus or that physics plays into that. And it's just a fractal of that.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think you want to oversell it too much.
Okay.
Because the way the physics of the universe sort of stacks up is it gives us these really fundamental rules, conservation of energy, that things at rest tend to stay at rest. So that's sort of like, hey, change requires change. So you can take certain pieces of it like momentum or gravity, and you can make analogies. Again, we all exist in this fabric of the physics and of the universe, but then that generates our biology, which we then exist in the fabric of our biology, right? Like I said, we're visual creatures, so we tend to want to paint stories that are visions. Our brain allows us to have story narratives, so that's why we use these sort of narratives. So that's our biology. Then on top of that, this noosphere that you're talking about, this sort of information universe, that's a real human construct, right? We've used the physics and we use the biology to be creative entities.
And how would you define the noosphere?
I think of it, so I think of it on a couple of levels, right? I think of everything in the universe in terms of sort of patterns. We're all patterns of information, right? You can abstract all the physical things in the world you want to, what's its pattern, and then how it's connected to other things, and then the patterns of those patterns, and so on and so on and so forth. So you can actually abstract everything in the universe to information if you want. The human noosphere I think of as this cognitive universe that we've constructed.
Be through the internet primarily.
Well, I think.
You think?
I mean,
that's how it distributes.
I think
itself?
more fundamentally, you could say again. This is where I would say the physics of that universe is story, right? The structures of story. That's how we make this information. Even when we create science and we create facts and we create data tables, even when we're creating those, because some of our stories can mislead us immensely. Right? We have very fundamental stories. We have stories that are in our heads that are based on our experience or based on our culture or based on what we learn. And they can be very out of touch with how the
total
world
fiction.
Yeah, it's not how the world works. I mean, think of Galileo and the famous experiment of dropping two things that, you drop a bowling ball and a ping pong ball. Clearly the bowling ball should go faster. I mean, come on. You drop a bowling ball on your foot, it hurts more. It should go faster. Try it. Try dropping a bowling ball and ping pong ball. They fall at the exact same speed. No human guesses that first. You have to go find that out. So we have these but my point is, even when we're building science to show us where our story is wrong, the science is a kind of story. It's a human construct. So it's part of the noosphere, right? So for me, I really think of it, even when I'm thinking of the information that you can abstract the universe to, again, that goes through our perception. There is nothing a human does that doesn't go through human perception.
Mm-hmm.
So we automatically filter the universe through ourselves, right? And we can't escape that. So there is no teasing apart physics as we know it, for example, and story. There is no teasing apart fact and fiction. There is no teasing apart rational and irrational or unemotional and emotional. These are all how humans journey through the universe.
Yeah.
And we, even though we may be trying to make a story construct like physics that lets us do a construct like math that helps us go like, that story is incorrect. Then we just build that into our next iteration of the story, right? So I don't know that you want to go all the way to saying like we're like little gas particles, because it actually takes away from the volition that we've created for ourselves through our own creativity, because we can construct universes, right? And we do it every day with our stories,
the storyverse.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, I kind of think of the Nuoverse or the new, I kind of think of it as actually our storyverse.
More of a storyverse.
Yeah.
Now, you've always been interesting to me because, so you got your PhD from Berkeley, smart guy, SoCal guy. What you see is what you get, but you're also a brilliant marketer. And I recognize that, of course, from all the work I've done in marketing. And you have had big impact on a lot of different organizations about helping them tell their story and find their way. How has your studies, and I don't know when you were studying physics, like I'm going to someday apply this in marketing and help companies grow. How did those two worlds come together?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I mean, again, through like anything else, right? We all have our passions. And when I was a little kid, I saw like you see some TV shows or whatever about animals being wiped out. And maybe this is when I knew there's a trick physicists use to think about things. You think about things at the extreme. Like you think about ice skating with no friction, or you think about, objects that have no mass, but they have moment. You think about things at the extreme. So I thought to myself, what if we wiped out all the animals? And I was like, the world won't work. It's just like, how would that work? There'd be no animals. We'd all die.
And how old were you when you were thinking of this?
Like maybe 5 or something. I don't know. Like I was like in kindergarten.
You were twisted, yeah.
Yeah, I was not normal. And I also then thought, well, and we're animals. So by definition, if you wipe out all the animals, by definition, you wipe out us. So the discussion that was going on at the time about whether or not we should actually save nature effectively, whether or not we could, just seemed in your little 5-year-old, that linear thinking you have when you're a kid, like that was just almost insane. So fast forward way up to, so curious, like science, get a PhD and, do physics, do biophysics. Physics and biophysics are good. You try to, again, find these underlying principles for complex systems. So I started to ask myself, what are the underlying principles that are leading us to loss in biodiversity or leading us to change the climate? Also, what are the underlying principles in what makes a great human enterprise? And started asking myself the basic question of, why is it difficult today for human enterprise to actually align with and be empowered by the best picture of how we know the world works? That just seemed to me like whoever's in the room who can help people do that. If I can help you use reality to do what you want to do, I'm like, that's a guy I want in the room, right? And so that led me to thinking about, what are these emerging challenges we have on a global scale? How should they impact your everyday decisions? Where does the rubber meet the road for everyday decisions? The rubber meets the road for everyday decisions in businesses. Businesses are where we get together and we do stuff, you get a business to figure something out. It's like, get out of the way. It'll run you over. Right. And so that led me to writing some papers, working with some folks. And next thing I knew, some of the stuff we were saying, some big companies around the world, IKEA and McDonald's and Home Depot and Bank of America, and just a whole Nike, whole bunch of folks said, that's interesting. Why don't you come and help us think through some of these things? And so I almost fell into having one world in biophysics and sustainability and education, and another foot in this other world of consulting and marketing. And at the end of the day, what was missing from the field, I watched the environmental groups yell and scream, and I watched the businesses effectively ignore.
Is this before you were teaching at ASU when you see that? So you were seeing that trend happening in the 1990s?
Yeah, the mid-90s, late 90s, early 2000s. We started an interesting nonprofit called The Natural Step that's still going, where we looked at, are there principles for sustainability that you could use as design guides? Is the world really so complicated that there's no underlying mechanisms that we can pull out? And the answer was no, we can pull some out, and so that's very physics like, right? Oh, it's super complicated. Is it? Newton, like, oh my gosh, how? Yeah, well, force equals mass times acceleration. Einstein, E equals mc squared, right? I mean, really? It's like, really? That's simple? You're like, yeah, it's simple, but then everything flows out of it, right? So
entropy,
right? Da, 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 da. So what I started to find was that some things had changed. For the first time, we have built businesses that are so large, right? Like I think Apple's market cap is bigger than something like 180 nations' gross domestic products. Somebody like Unilever is in like 190 countries around the world, right? We've built these economic enterprises that are so large that their everyday decisions have global scale impacts. So they've broken the long-term, short-term thinking thing. Their short-term thinking has large-scale impacts.
And you're talking about physical impacts. It's everything from the planet to social structures to economies.
Yeah, I mean, think about your Home Depot and you sell over a quarter of the lumber in the United States. How you decide to purchase wood matters to the forests of the United States, right? You're a big food company or something like McDonald's, how you decide to get your beef or something has impacts on, say, the Amazon, because you have a lot of farmers growing beef down there and whatnot. And that's just on the physical side. There's also the human side, right? Your everyday decisions impacts, whether kids are working or not, or whether these folks have money or, in different places or not. And it's not all negative. I mean, again, these are human enterprises. These are business. They're built for us by us. So there's, from my perspective, there's not a morality play here. It's how do we build better organizations that help people do what they want, increasingly successfully and increasingly sustainability. And therefore, how is it a platform for success? And that's where I started to bring together the biophysics of how does the world actually work. And what I found was that the field, quote unquote, the folks who were like going, hey, running around, raising red flags, we've got to save the panda, or watch out about the climate, or what about child labor, or what about global equity, or all these issues. They just kept yelling more. Let me tell you another way why you have to save the panda. Let me tell you one more reason why you should believe climate change is the most important thing in the world. They forgot that people are people. They're story creatures. They forgot about human perception. So they constantly leaned into the fact model. And you know what? Facts are great, but it's great to see statistics and read them, but you actually don't go to the baseball game for the stats, You go there to see the drama of the game, right? And it's the same thing here. So then I had to re-educate myself on, the social side of things, on the story side of things, on the marketing side of things. And so in that sense, all these big issues we're dealing with today, climate change or the border wall, all of these things, they're story issues, right? They're story challenges, because the stories we tell ourselves, the stories our organizations tell internally, externally, those are the highways that we travel to get to wherever we're going. And we go where those stories are pointing us,
So let me ask you, before you give us an example of some of the work you did in the early days, when we started bringing this together, let's just fast forward to where we are now. We've got Trump. We've got the far right. We've got a lot of people that don't believe in climate change and global warming, and it's hoo-ah, and let's just keep cranking out, oil, gas, coal, pouring more carbon into the atmosphere. And then, of course, you've got the far left that is, oh my God, the sky is falling. And we don't seem to have any middle ground of logic, of reason, of nuance that is really impacting what's happening in the world on both polarities. You've got stories that have gravitational pull on the left and right and religions and everything else. In your experience, how and what can we do, and where have you seen it actually work in an organization to bring two polarized worlds together through the use of story to find common ground and say, oh, wait a minute, maybe we could find each other in a story that unites us?
Sure. Well, I mean, and it's easier to see where there's the friction, right? It's easier to see the fire where there's the heat, where there's,
like that's the problem.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's easier to, it feels like nothing's working, but actually there's a lot of places where things are working. So for example, as I sort of said, like we built science to help us understand where our narrative stories, our creative stories aren't quote unquote right. Mm-hmm. And again, the science is its own type of story. Well, so we have some places right now, for example, where like these big businesses that I mentioned, where they've got one foot in the, say, biophysical world. They use trees to make lumber, or they use topsoil to make food.
Cows to make
burgers, or people to make the stuff, right?
Ooh, I thought you were going to say people to make burgers.
People to make
the burgers.
People to make burgers,
okay.
Soylent Green. But they have a real physical footprint. And so they're running into these challenges of climate and topsoil and biodiversity. They're running into these things and they're getting stomach aches for it, right? It's nice to argue the theory of the ocean warming and ocean water rising. As it rises, it floods coastal areas. Most of the production capacity, a lot of the production capacity for the things that we use every day, the factories and the ports and the shipping, it's all on the coast. They get flooded. That stuff shuts down. That stuff shuts down, the products don't flow. The products don't flow, the businesses can't sell. The businesses can't sell, they can't make money. They get a stomach ache. So for them, it's all great to have a big debate over whether the oceans are rising or not. If the oceans are rising, they feel it economically. And then they're like, what does that mean? So then they have a story challenge. Because right now, our organizations they have an old industrial story. The old industrial story is nature is a subset of businesses, which are a subset of society. So nature is just there for you to use. And it actually doesn't have a lot of value till you use it. The reality is businesses as a subset of society, we're all embedded in nature. Didn't used to matter. We just weren't big enough. Now it matters. All of a sudden, our big global businesses can feel the way the world actually is. Again, the challenge is all of that goes through human perception. So what you're feeling, what you're describing is our narratives, the stories we're telling ourselves.
So we've got scientists saying, yeah, we are impacting this climate. And then we've got business people that are saying, no, we're not.
Well, sort of. I think what we have is we have the reality of stuff is starting to impact us. And that's where we feel it. That's the biophysics of it. And you can't deny it. It's like you can argue all you want whether gravity exists or not, jump off your roof and, you'll hit the floor type of thing, right? On the flip side, we have these...
And entropy, by the way, because you'll have broken that leg
you'll
and
be
you
a lot
will
messier.
have split. Yes, exactly.
Right. And on the flip side, we have a bunch of narratives that are embedded in us that came from before this new reality mattered. So we have these old stories from the industrial model.
And that is that nature is at our disposal.
Nature's at our disposal, or that it doesn't even.
Which is ironic in even saying it that
no,
way.
But however, it's been very useful for us. So for example, right, you might actually think to yourself, why is it so hard to get air pollution laws actually passed? I mean, who wants polluted air? Nobody. Can you see polluted air? Yeah, you can. So, but still, like, why is it so hard to get the fuel efficiency changed? Well, because the old model that said, let's put nature underneath business and let business do what it wants, it's what built all of this. So by ignoring things like air pollution, by ignoring things like water pollution, by ignoring certain, labor, it's allowed us to build all the stuff we've built. So it's had a big upside. It just turns out that ignorance, right? And that's what ignoring is, right? That ignorance. Now these big companies and our economy is also, I'd say it's pooping, right? It's like pooping out these big sustainability
Is that
issues.
a physics?
That's highly
word?
technical.
Yeah.
Probably everybody's confused, but
Yeah, you got a white paper on that.
Yeah, it's published refereeing. These businesses are now also one of their major outputs is not just the products and services that we want. One of the major outputs is the set of systems impacts that we don't want, but our stories haven't caught up.
The systems impact are the impact on the planet.
Climate change, all right. Also, but our stories are still the stories that allowed us to ignore all that. So, right? So we're in a transition period. It's totally understandable. We have to update our stories. Science is part of that. It's insufficient. You can't just yell and scream at people. Positive business stories are. We're starting to see, again, independent of policy. Government policy and all can make these things happen much quicker, but it takes time to make the policy. The shift has to happen there too. We're seeing businesses starting to say, Home Depot, like, oh, I can't just cut down wherever I want. So Home Depot has a whole policy now on, Forest Stewardship Council certified sustainable timber, right? We're starting to see organizations. McDonald's, it's hard to tell that they've changed from the outside, but if you look down their supply chain, they now can reach down to the farm and the topsoil. And so when they get asked about some of these questions, it's not nonsensical to them. They can scratch their, institutional head and go like, oh, maybe we should do something about that. We've seen a transition in the combustion engine. Countries like China and states like California have said, we're going to get out of the combustion engine business for cars. 5 years ago, that would be an unimaginable, again, a story statement, an unimaginable story. And yet now people are saying, you know what, let's head towards electric vehicles. And then let's get those electrons for the electric vehicles from, say, solar energy. And then the system that exists, the immune system reacts and goes, no, I make a lot of money from fossil fuels. I don't want the electrons to be from solar. And so it's very natural. The challenge with the natural part. I'm not really bummed out by the arguments. It's actually very understandable. We've got these big institutions that are vested in yesterday's thinking and yesterday's stories.
And yesterday's economy. And
we've got to change. And it's not that, and that will change, everybody. That economy serves about a third of the planet. And in serving it, it makes these unsustainability challenges. So it is changing. On the flip side, we have a group of people who are trying to update the story narrative through facts, through new ways of thinking, through creating new businesses. There's a whole suite of new businesses that are coming up from the ground up with this idea of a sustainable future as their differentiation. So somebody like a Wild Planet Foods that sells tuna fish, that the better their business does, the stronger wild populations of tuna are, for example. They've literally built their business in such a way that it's good for wild populations of tuna. Now, that may mean they can't make as much tuna, but it also means if you're a big existing business and you want to mimic them, you'd actually have to transform your business into them, which also then gives them a unique, differentiated and defensible position in the market that's allowed them to push over some of the largest producers of tuna, for example, in the world, and sell their tuna as like a fundamentally different product. We're not just tuna. We're tuna that saves the planet, that's good for you. You don't like to eat tuna? Have you quit eating tuna, for example, because of the dolphins and all? Now you can again. That's a fundamentally different business proposition. So to me, there's, the good story is we're starting to see the big guys having to react. They're going to react slowly. We got to keep working on it. We're starting to see emerging organizations that are using these new stories to literally say, I'm a different thing, and bust their way into the market. And they're some of the fastest growing businesses we have. They're still small, right? And we're constantly working on updating our narratives, right? And when you put all that together, it really becomes a matter of speed. Like, can we do it fast enough? The grinding wheel of reality, right? That the world is changing and we need to update our organizations to absorb that. That's just not going to go away. That's just the way it is. That's the way it's always been, right? The question comes down to, can we do it fast enough? What does leadership look like that helps us do that? How do we transform all these suites of problems from a set of problems, which, let's face it, if I say to you, hey, Park, it's Friday, on Monday, you have to fix climate, that's disempowering. Whereas if I say to you, hey, Park, it's Friday, let's look at this new set of stories and this new set of facts that will help you make better decisions for your organization on Monday. That's empowering to a human being. So we have to overall transform this whole dialogue from a disempowering big picture to a set of helping people make better decisions, right? That help their organizations do better and help us build a sustainable future to help by making their organizations do better, that build a sustainable future. And that brings us back around to why these, we really are in a story challenge,
Well, let's go back to JFK for a second. So he throws out this big science fiction story to get America to buy into it. And of course, invested billions to make it happen. But all of the technology and all of the industry that came out of that moonshot, I would argue, aren't we in kind of a same situation here? Although we would call it an earth shot, as you're looking at renewables and battery technology and what Tesla has done with that, just what you just talked about with, tuna farming and so forth. Isn't there just tremendous opportunity and money to be made by addressing these climate issues?
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, literally no doubt. Like proven fact that when you have a paradigm shift, and the paradigm shift is better aligned with the way it is and going to be, right? That's called being ahead of the curve. And, it's funny. If you take creativity, which we all bring with us, and you add a new perspective, right? Necessity, the mother of invention, new perspective. And you add to that permission to act. And that permission is both like literally permission, because it's going to be messy, but also the resources. If you take those three things, creativity, new perspective, and permission, human beings literally generate innovation. That's like, you could argue that's our fundamental differentiator. That's how we go out and succeed in this universe, right? So if creativity we all bring, if that new perspective is, a better understanding of how the world works and sustainability, and we give ourselves permission and resources, we will just generate new innovative ways forward. And it's already happening. We're, again, 20 years ago, could we do solar energy? Now you can get solar energy on California just said in the future, all homes in California will have solar energy, right? We've seen a transformation in the auto industry, in hybrid cars, in electric vehicles, in self-driving cars, and thinking about how can self-driving cars be finally a mass transit system that Americans can unite behind. If you look at sort of like your example you gave earlier, like you're watching this truck and it's dumping this dirt and all the smoke is coming out and the smoke is, well, let's get rid of the smoke. That's a low value proposition for a business. Just so far, we've just ignored it, right? But if we don't ignore it, it actually creates, okay, well then what kind of engines get rid of the smoke? What else can you use? All of a sudden, all these new opportunities arise. And we're seeing it. We're seeing the businesses come online. We're seeing the business growth. At the same time, it's understandable, but frankly, we have to not accept it. The inertia against change. Because our biggest institutions today were built with the old model where you could ignore the smoke, right? Where the smoke wasn't just a bad thing. It was an indicator of success. The more air pollution, the more business you were doing, right?
Well, and look at utilities. They have all of this built infrastructure, and so much of it is off of, coal fire plants and nuclear, and people freak out about all that stuff. But the fact of the matter is, they still have to turn on their lights, quote unquote, every day and pay their bills. And so it's not going to happen overnight, and they're trapped in that.
Right. And we can tie this, and I think it's very important to tie this into real concerns of real people. This isn't going to go anywhere, because this is about people, right? We are people. We care about people. When we talk about a sustainable future, it's a sustainable future for people, right? So you have to start with people. And people are really concerned today. They are worried that the future isn't going to be better than the past. They're worried about their kids, right? On a global scale, there's still half the planet that really isn't part of the modern economy the way we would think of it. They don't have access to the things that Americans take for granted, like clean water or health systems or whatnot. And so we need to start there and ask ourselves, how does having this bigger story of understanding how the world works, so we get back to the science and whatnot, how do you bring those two things together to say, for example, let's say a lot of jobs are going to get displaced by robots, or let's say artificial intelligence is going to actually have a big impact. And you look at it and you're like, that sounds pretty bad. But let's say it's true. The question we have to ask ourselves is, how do we make that into a good story? So for example, how do you have a business model where the more robots you have and the more efficient it gets, the more everybody who helped build that business is better off? So you don't get displaced economically, right? Maybe you have more free time. Can you imagine when you were 12 years old? Right now, it's something like 20% of our productive capacity could make everything that we need in the US. We're that good, right? We're great.
That efficient.
Yeah, we're great. We're great. Americans are can-do people. We're awesome, right? And so we can produce. We just don't need all of us to spend all of our time making stuff, right? So let's say you're like 12 and somebody said, when you grow up and you're going to be an adult, you're only going to have to work 1 day a week and you're going to get 6 days a week off to do what you want. You were 12, you'd be like, oh, I got to work a day, right? Right now, we're so tied to this model of we are our job and whatnot. And again, not to be utopic, but as we think about using productive capacities, we think about aligning with how the world, as we think about the sun shines 10,000 times, more energy than we use at any moment. So renewable energy is like the biggest free takeaway. It's the biggest Groupon ever, right? As we think about bringing these efficiencies that right now we're used to the old model, but we can be so much more efficient with our water. Right now we use water once and, we might turn it into sewage waste. That water can go around. It's like we can be so much smarter to actually allow ourselves to have more goods and services with less effort and more economic value. That's what's actually hanging out there. So we have to work to, or it will behoove us to work to not fall into the trap of just arguing and getting stuck in yesterday's narratives, but actually have the boldness to sort of build the future narratives we want. And then going back to the moonshot and the gravity and all that, how do we let those narratives pull us forward using the best science, modifying our institutions so that we can actually, get to where we want to go.
Better.
Yeah.
Final question for you then, George. Are you positive, optimistic about the stories we're telling ourselves and the momentum where it's taking us, or how much work do we have to get, to do? Are we living in a comedy, a tragedy, or a happily ever after?
we're certain.
I think at one point you told me you felt like your whole life was a Monty Python sketch.
Yeah, right. I've been in so many of these, so many conversations where I'm looking around for the comedy writers that I'm sure are that I'm part of this. I think a couple of things. I think one, there are timing issues. We do have to be careful that we don't fall into the trap of being afraid. We all know as adults, being really, really afraid is a bad state of mind to be in when you make really critical decisions. So we have to, I think, not fall into the trap of seeing that right now there are disjoints between the way the world actually works and what we're doing, right? So like you look at something like the border issue, for example, and right now, a great way, really the best way in the world to improve yourself is to move to a place that's better. And so that does drive, folks moving across the border.
And that's a very natural inclination.
It's a natural thing. But so we have to have a smart border. We have to don't be afraid and don't build a wall. And we have to have a smart policy there. So I think we don't want to give into fear. We want to lean into our American optimism and our can-do attitudes and lean into being people who help other people. Those fairness, camaraderie, pioneering, these are all very core American, ideals. So I think we lean into those. I think at the end of the day, I don't actually waste a lot of time with pessimism.
I've never known you to.
Yeah. Well, why not be an optimist?
Yeah,
you can be a rationalist. You can be a realist. You can be a functional optimist or a functional skeptic or whatever. But I tend to say I might as well try versus spending a lot of time figuring out lists of why I can't, So that's my sort of native bend.
Yeah.
And we'll see.
Well, that's awesome. George, thank you so much for being here on the Business of Story.
My pleasure.
Where can people find out more about you and your work? And I know you've got a ton of white papers and some really interesting stuff out there on physics and marketing and how to approach it all. Where can they find it?
Well, there's, you can just hop online and look at me up at ASU. And it's also interesting to see what's going on at ASU in general in this space. We published a big academic set of the Business of Sustainability, a big 3-volume set. And then if you just really pop online, there's actually just a lot of stuff that is out there that's circulating around these topics.
Say it in Italian for me again, your name?
Giorgio Matteo Basile.
Basile. So it's George Basile, Basile. There you go.
I'll have every Italian now is going to call up and tell me that, no, that's not how you actually say that.
Well, awesome. Thanks so much for being here. And thanks for listening to this edition of The Business of Story. If you find this physics of story as fascinating as I do and what George has shared with us today, feel free to share this episode with a friend, colleague, someone that is trying to get their head around their narrative, storytelling, physics, sustainability, whatever it might be. It is a study that has just fascinated me because I've seen the bewitchery of story in action every day in my speaking engagements and the deliberate practice programs that I teach. And so I even, George, call it now the applied science and bewitchery of story. You have to understand the magic if you're going to combat or cast the spell, depending on what side of the aisle you're sitting on. And we have these proven story frameworks, everything from the and, but, and therefore, which I learned from another doctor, Dr. Randy Olson, to the 5 primal elements of story that you can use in any of your stories out there, to, of course, the story cycle system that I created, built out. It was inspired by Joseph Campbell's 19-step hero's journey. Mine is 10 steps mapped exactly to business, for everything from business strategy to brand story strategy to sustainability to organizing your people around a narrative that everybody can live into and prosper from. So thank you again for just helping me with my own education and sort of vetting my thoughts through all of this.
Always a pleasure to do anything with Park.
And remember, folks, be with us next week when we'll have another amazing story artist like George here on The Business of Story. And until then, remember that the most potent story you'll ever tell is the story you tell yourself. So make it a great one. Thanks for listening.